Hello, everyone. Ian Hamilton with Good Virtual Reality here, and thanks for giving me your time today. In case you're new, you can become a subscriber at goodvirtualreality.com. Many episodes of this podcast head out over email, first to paid subscribers before publishing everywhere. Thank you to my founding members, paid subscribers, sponsors, and the donations I've received supporting the production of this independent journalism directly. Today, I've got a very different podcast that I'm used to. It's coming to you by way of a reader. So thank you to Christopher for this idea. They wrote me that you've interviewed so many developers, builders, journalists, and people working inside XR, but I realized I have not heard your own VR story in the same full way. As someone who loves VR, XR, and the whole emerging medium, I would love to hear an episode where the community gets to interview you. Basic idea would be I'll send you 5 to 10 questions first, focused on your journey and your years at UploadVR and what you learned, and then invite your readers and listeners to contribute their own questions too. So I'm going to do this in 2 parts. This will be the first part of that. And if you have any questions, you can email editor@goodvirtualreality.com, and I will do a second part of this podcast to go over those answers as well. So the first question from Christopher was, what was your first VR experience that made you realize this medium was not just another gaming peripheral, but something larger? That would have to be Titans of Space. I saw Titans of Space. It must have been on either the DK1 or the DK2 back in 2013 or 2014. Saw it very early on. I believe it was distributed on Oculus Share first. But in case you're unfamiliar, Titans of Space is sort of tour of the solar system and then the largest bodies of the universe, all the biggest stars. And in the first 10 seconds of Titans of Space, you're in a spaceship and you look out and you see the Earth floating in front of you. The moon and the Earth are both to scale with one another, and they're 1/1 millionth of their actual size. And as you're looking at them, you realize there's something yellow off to the right, and you turn your head to the right and you see the sun. It's larger than you can possibly comprehend, and it is 1/1 millionth of its actual scale. And so in those first 10 seconds of Titans of Space, you'll have a more human understanding of the scale of the universe or the scale of our solar system, everything we see every day, than you can get out of a book, than you can get out of a movie. The developer there, Steve Drash or Steve D, that's all they ever identify themselves as online. Talked to them a number of times over the years. They've added a bunch of features to Titans of Space. It even has hand tracking today, and there's a beautiful narrator that will help and sort of guide you along on their journey, which is just beautifully animated. Lots of facts down on your spaceship that you can access about the scale of the universe. But to answer this question specifically was just this moment where I realized that this was an education platform, a teaching platform, something where you can understand using your human senses in a way that nothing else could really achieve. When I was much younger, I went to space camp one summer. I've always been obsessed with the stars and the scale of the universe. The movie Contact had a big impact on me. I've watched every episode of Star Trek ever made. I love those stories, those moral plays that sort of get you to think about things from a different perspective. And then in high school, I was on the Space Settlement Design team, and actually my best friend still to this day was on that team every year, and we designed space stations together for a competition that NASA held each summer. The 8 best schools in the world would get to go to NASA Kennedy Space Center in Florida and compete in a finalist competition. So I learned a lot during those 4 years of meeting with all the other nerds on campus who liked robotics and space travel and science. We were advised by the physics teacher, incredible teacher up there in Tehachapi, California. And we would meet weekly and then go off to our different sections and build little subgroups and design the space station. My section of the space station was always human factors. And so we would have to design a space station for Earth orbit one year, and then like Mars orbit another year, and the asteroid belt another year. And these space stations were all imagined to be in like 2030, 2040, 2050, way off in the future, when it cost a lot less to send rockets up and robots were more advanced, and we could depend on those technologies to aid us in our designs and the cost projections that we're coming up with for how much it would cost to make our space station and actually have it brought to fruition. So each year we were finalists in this competition, and we had to go out there and raise money just like the other clubs would from sponsors to help pay for our airfare and get their names put on our t-shirts. And then go to NASA and try this finalist competition. We never won the finalist competition. That was a hugely impactful experience for me, learning to be part of a team that wasn't just out there playing soccer or baseball, learning how to deal with people who talk very differently, think very differently than you, and still come up with this product. Get near the end of the year, and we'd have to put together a report that couldn't be any longer than 40 pages. And my friend, this was 2000 to 2003, but my friend was already doing CGI back then, and he would produce these incredible color renderings of our space station, and we would have these far out designs. The classic design of a space station is a ring, because you can spin the ring and then give it gravity around the ring by spinning it. And it was sort of like the culmination of all my Star Trek that I had been raised on. All the science camp was like, this is how we could apply this to the real world. And it's just, I have to bring all this up in the context of Titans of Space, because gosh, if you could put Titans of Space on more people at younger ages and build a whole program around that sort of education with a teacher that really understands what the kid is seeing in the headset and how to build on that. The kid comes out of a headset and they've just understood better than any book that they could go get in the library that the sun is unimaginably larger than the earth and the moon. And you ask them questions like, what would be the gravity like if you were on the surface of the sun? And they should be able to understand that, well, the bigger the body, the more the gravity is. I would be crushed if I was on the surface of the sun. Well, you could read a couple paragraphs of a book and try to come to that same understanding. But I'm just absolutely convinced that VR can deliver that more quickly. And it did for me in that demo. Just you go from the sun and then you start seeing the sun to scale with other stars throughout the universe. And you realize our sun is tiny by comparison to the largest celestial bodies out there imaginable. And it's just everything I am comes back to these sorts of things. And that was the experience that I come back to. So I highly recommend you check out Titans of Space if you haven't seen it already. And there's a lot of other examples of other experiences that are learning apps that can really pique your interest in ways that they really should. I feel bad for the developers behind these projects because they're geniuses, but they haven't been given a platform or tools to really put these things into schools. There's a periodic table learning app, and they've just, these apps have had to suffer. These platforms want to create a consumer platform, not an education platform. So yeah, that was the first VR experience that made me realize the medium was not just another gaming peripheral, but something larger. There's been a lot more since then. So the next question, when you first became a VR journalist, what did you think VR was going to become, and how has reality surprised you? Such a great question, very complex. So when I first became a VR journalist, I would put that date in 2014. I had already been reporting on VR for a couple of years at that point at the Orange County Register down in Southern California. Oculus was started as a local company to me. I was a technology reporter at the Orange County Register and started reporting on them when they were still in the Kickstarter, basically. And then shortly after, I went out and did my first face-to-face interviews, went out after they sort of set up their offices in Orange County and pulled it together. And I did the duct tape demo, and it was just a duct tape prototype of these parts held together. Went and met a couple of the founders and did an interview where you can actually listen to that interview on the Good VR podcast. It's one of the first episodes where I talked to Brendan Uribe. I put the audio through an audio filter to try to improve its quality from my iPhone recording to now. But you can hear the basic questions I was asking and, dreaming of Portal in VR, even though, I sort of know it's going to be uncomfortable because of the way it works. And still today, I think of how can we make Portal work? Can you do it third person? And is there any way to do that sort of thing? But I put the timing as when I became a VR journalist as 2014, because early in that year, Mark Zuckerberg came out to Oculus, did demos there. And then as I understand it, he went to the VR Interaction Lab at Stanford and did the demos there, and then came back and decided to buy Oculus for somewhere between $2 and $3 billion. When that happened, I was driving home on the freeway in the early afternoon to do the last few hours of my day from home. And I got a call from my editor who said, did you hear the latest about the company that you've been reporting on? They just sold to Facebook for $2 billion. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'll have an article for you within an hour. Just let me get through traffic here. So I went home and made some calls on the way home and started putting together my immediate news article. Next day, I did a deeper article. And I think even the third day, I did an even bigger article because it was one of the biggest acquisition stories to happen in Orange County history. Shortly after that, the Orange County Register held layoffs, and the editor at the time negotiated a deal to make it a buyout offer where you had a chance to get a week of severance for each year you put into the company if you took the buyout. So I had worked there 5 years. I could get 5 weeks of pay if I left the company, and I took it. I very quickly decided that my heart was in VR. I was already having to negotiate that I shouldn't put more than 30% of my time into reporting on VR while I was at the Orange County Register. And I'm like, no, I really, my heart's, I've seen the future. I think this is it. And so I took the buyout, took the 5 weeks of severance, bought a PC. I got the DK2 during that period and started, doing videos for my personal site. And then I started a newsletter with my friend since junior high. We started the VR Digest newsletter. If anyone who's listening to this who subscribed to the VR Digest way back in the day, that was me. I did that, and I worked freelance for a while there, bought the Gear VR Innovator Edition and got my first Samsung Note phone and reviewed that for the San Diego Union Tribune. I did a little article about it and was freelancing there for a while, and then I heard about UploadVR in 2015 and met one of the co-founders at the announcement event for the Rift. I believe that was in 2015. But I was writing for myself there for a good year, doing that newsletter for a while. And then I got sort of sucked into Upload VR and took a full-time job working there in 2015, especially after they got their first major investment near the end of 2015. They were able to sort of properly bring me on as, really meet my salary requirements. It's important I give this backstory because I was never an owner of Upload VR. I never had a single share. When it comes time to change the course of the company, you have no leverage. And the only leverage is basically quit or get fired without those shares of stock or a seat on the board. And so there were various times where I advised the people I was working with not to do certain things and to behave certain ways. And, a lot of the time they would listen, and I have a lot of gray hair now. And I think a fair amount of it is from having to explain these things to people of, why editorial concerns should be separate from making money concerns, why we need to be asking certain questions and not other questions, why we need to be balanced in our headlines and not clickbaity, things like that. So returning to this question of when you first became a VR journalist, what do you think VR was going to become? It's really critical I bring up a demo here that I had in addition to Oculus. I got to try Cave in 2012, the same year that I tried the headset from Oculus. And a Cave, for those that don't understand what it is, it's basically a projector-based system where they beam projectors at all the walls and then track your head movements and produce VR that way. So kind of like a complete opposite sort of system for how a headset works. And I saw one at Disney. Disney was using them to visualize their Cars Land before it opened. And you could go on a Cars Land ride basically as one of the executives of Disney before it opens. And they had visualizations of how the ride would look. And you could get to the top of a ride and see that a sight line is wrong, that the illusion of Disneyland is broken because the ride isn't tall enough or the mountain that they've built isn't quite right. And you could ask for a correction to fix that based on the visualization you saw in VR and being able to actually, be a 6 foot tall person looking out in this direction in this particular seat on a ride. And that's what VR was bringing to Disney. And so I got to see what $1 million or hundreds of thousands of dollar room would cost and what it could do. And then I saw the Rift, the duct tape demo put together from the same class of parts that they use in cell phones, and realizing that there's an economic way to make this possible. It's not just the idea of science fiction or the holodeck. And so I knew that VR could become this everything medium. I read Jeremy Bailenson book, Experience on Demand, which walked you through how you could have any kind of experience. You could train at a fraction of the cost to do things that you couldn't do physically that would be too dangerous. So flight training, car driving, huge mechanical operations where you need to do something right in a high stress scenario. Otherwise, millions of dollars are lost or people die. Those sorts of things you learn all those sorts of things in VR very, very quickly. So I knew from that time, 2014, that it could be this thing. And how has reality surprised you is the other half of this question. It's such a great question. What I have to balance in my answer here is that I'm such a skeptic in my heart, and I have to balance being a skeptic with this believer in the medium. It's a very difficult sort of thing to hold both these ideas in my mind at the same time. When I see Mark Zuckerberg buy Oculus, it's sort of like, really? You're going to make a game system with this? Okay, let's see how it goes. I always have the commentator in Dodgeball in my head. Bold move, Cotton. Let's see how it works out for him. Like that's how I've sort of watched the entire medium go. You fast forward a couple years to things like the Oculus Go and $200 headset, 3 DOF only, so you can't lean around in it to get that really fantastic feeling that you get in the DK2 from a couple years earlier, or the Rift even. But it is this attempt at mainstream VR. It's this attempt, so Facebook is making a bet, Oculus is making a bet that there is a mainstream audience for this thing. And like, yeah, I'm looking at it going, okay, let's present what you think it's going to become, while in the back of my mind going, I don't know if it's this, right? Like, I think it's something else. I think there's something missing here. I remember I put my dad into a Gear VR and showed him a 360 video, and his very first comment was, the porn on this is going to be incredible. And I appreciated him taking one look at VR video and instantly realizing what one of its killer use cases are. He lived through the whole Betamax versus VHS battle. He was on the bulletin boards of the 80s and AOL in the 90s, and using those to chat with strangers all over the world. And here was this new thing that was going to have very different use cases than a gaming device alone. And I think I'm starting to point out here some of the mismatch. So like, how has reality surprised you? Everything I'm doing, reporting on Oculus, reporting on Facebook buying Oculus, going out to Valve and trying out their things. Yeah, games are cool. But what's really cool is talking to people, meeting people you couldn't meet any other way, interacting with strangers in ways that are harmless to you or the stranger. And you do that as adults, right? Like you get to have those experiences when you know the risks involved and know how to protect yourself. So where I'm going with this is VR chat. I don't think it's any surprise that VR chat is a force to be reckoned with in the VR market. I'd be very curious if Facebook ever made an attempt to buy VR chat over the years. It's what I was saying about the training, right? If you can train to practice to fly a jet without any harm to yourself or to hardware, you can certainly practice to be a certain kind of person or to interact with others inside of virtual reality. And I think that's what we see in VR chat. I think we see people trying on identities and looking in the mirror and then interacting with others as that person, as that being, and seeing how it feels for them. I think there's a pathway of self-exploration and self-expression there that's completely transparent and not going away anytime soon, that it continues to grow year after year. And so the answer to that question of what did I think VR was going to become? It's becoming that. It's becoming the everything device. You can see in all these different verticals, all these different like single use cases, it finding its sort of audience, despite it's still, you go back, you degrade your eyes from 2020 to whatever the optics are capable of the moment you put on the headset. And so like, even though the visuals aren't retina level where they're better than what you can see with the naked eye, you already have people that are playing games, socializing, training, doing all sorts of things in VR, despite all the limitations. And you just talk about 10 years of limitations. That's what we've had to overcome. It's just discovering what limitation is sort of going to cap the potential of a certain vertical, gaming being the latest one that's sort of being discovered. You go see VR chat and you see people spending entire weekends in there because they get to explore their identity. They get to meet people they couldn't meet physically around them. And I think that's beautiful. I read Ready Player One back early on, and it's very much VR chat is what Ready Player One sort of describes. And I think it's slowly developing this thing. The flip side of all this is what happens to the real world and what sort of obligations do we have to the physical world and the ways our parents or grandparents did things and the world they tried to create. What responsibility do we have to sort of make the world itself better? And that's a hard question to answer. It's very easy to online or as a journalist blame one technology for another thing. I don't know how easy that is to do. One of the overall narratives that I'll have on Good Virtual Reality is what is the relationship between things that have happened in the real world and the rise of virtual reality? And I'm not going to say there is no relationship. I think there is, but I also think it's way more complex than anyone else can really fathom from a distance. So how has reality surprised you? Still coming back to that sort of secondary question. It has surprised me that VR hasn't taken off, that none of these attempts have succeeded. But at the same time, you can see the errors of judgment and planning. One of my first articles quoted a guy at an analyst group that was researching video games, and they said that VR has to do things better than the thing that came before it. And if you listen to my most recent podcast with like Devin, the creator of Job Simulator, and most recent application Stellar Cafe, he says very much the same thing, that until VR can replace an existing product category, it isn't going to take off. And if you go back over the last decade with that in mind, you can see devices that attempt to replace existing categories. Apple Vision Pro is $3,500 and it's 60% or maybe 50% of a Mac. You know, you don't have Mac apps, you don't have the Mac desktop. You need a companion Mac in order to do those things. You don't have a keyboard, like you can't type on a surface, any surface anywhere. You have to go get a mouse, you have to go get a keyboard. They've got all this software to allow you to interact with a Mac in various ways, and Android XR sort of does similar things. Goodness, I'm looking at the Steam frame and I'm dreaming of how that is. I mean, when I went to Valve's headquarters late last year, I pulled up the Linux desktop inside of the Steam frame. And I'm realizing, wait, I can stick a 2 terabyte SD card into this Steam frame and it can contain any video, any photo, all the music that I want. And I can put it into any application on this Steam desktop, on this Linux desktop that I want. And yeah, that is starting to replace like an existing product category. And the irony there is the existing product category is probably the Steam Deck. And there's going to be a bunch of reasons why it won't do that, right? Like the Steam frame isn't going to run Steam Deck games at the same performance levels as the Steam Deck because of all the translation layers and restrictions on performance. That's why it has all the streaming functionalities. So you can stream those games from a nearby PC. But still, the idea is still sound. The software is made to support the idea that it's a PC on your face. So, like, it's not an end-all be-all machine, the Steam frame isn't, but it's just ever so closer to this dream of replacing an existing device category. I remember I interviewed some Oculus executives way back in the day, and I asked them to try to describe what VR was, and is it a communications device? I wanted them to put it in one of these buckets, and they refused to do that. Like the PR person directed the executive not to answer that question. And that's a bummer. Like it's a bummer that no one has said, let's replace this category of device. You know, Vision Pro could replace an iPad, but also you don't use an iPad very much, right? Like you use it in between. And then there's also the startup cost of like, if you want an iPad, if you want to watch a movie on an iPad in bed, you put it on a stand and you set it up between you and your loved one. And now you're watching a movie on your iPad in bed. If you wanted to do that same thing with a Vision Pro, you have to spend $7,000. You can't just get one Vision Pro. You have to get two. It cuts you off from every other device. The thing that has surprised me about VR is that when you replace reality, you're also responsible for the person's reality. And, you know, reality is pretty dang good, right? We haven't reached the level, or at least not everywhere, We haven't reached the level of dystopia that was shown in Ready Player One. You have the CTO of Meta looking at the COVID pandemic and saying that now is VR's moment. I've seen these hockey stick moments before where adoption spikes, and yeah, VR is now over the hockey stick moment. And he misread a pandemic as being good news for his technology. And a few years passed, and they've had to lay off thousands and thousands of employees because they misread the moment, and they built two devices that were misread for the moment. And yeah, so it has surprised me that like no one has had the vision to produce a device that can really replace an existing product category. If you look at something like Big Screen Beyond, you see a big screen trying very hard to replace the movie theater, and they're doing a really good job of it, but it's still extremely difficult. The thing buzzes, it gets hot, feels a little bit tight to your head sometimes, even though it's the lightest headset by a wide margin. You can buy extra accessories to do this, but it's not great to have to connect to a PC, right? You don't have a puck on your side that can drive the device on your head. And to that point, like even big screen, having your friends join in big screen in order for you to watch a movie is a tall ask. I want this feature where if you're wearing something like a Vision Pro or a Big Screen Beyond and you're watching a movie in VR, it should project a version of the movie onto a nearby television set so that the people in the room can watch the movie synced up with you. And the great thing about this idea is you could be watching the movie in 4K in 3D inside of your VR headset while the person watching the regular television could be watching the movie with captions on, or even with a different language. So you could be watching a movie in the same room physically with someone else, and they could be listening to the dubbed version of a movie or any version of the movie that's different, just time synced to you in your VR headset, which is the superior version. I'm describing years more software that needs to be built for VR to replace, a movie theater, for it to replace an iPad, and that still doesn't exist. All right, so next question is what was the biggest story you covered at Upload VR that changed how you understood the industry? What a fascinating question. So there was a research project that was released, and I think about it quite a lot. I believe it was researchers at Princeton. They had built a robot that could make deliveries to you in a VR headset. And the way this works is you imagine yourself in a VR headset sitting at a table doing your work on a keyboard and mouse with virtual screens and floating in front of you, and you think, oh, I want a can of Coke. So you bring up your menu and you grab a can of Coke from the air and you put it on your table right next to your keyboard and mouse. And what these researchers had shown was a UI mechanism where the can of Coke can slowly fill in from the bottom to the top. And you could see like a little indicator over the can of Coke, 1%, 2%, 3%, 4%. And eventually at 100%, the can of Coke is there. You can reach forward with your hand, grab it, and it's actually a can of Coke sitting there. And what had happened, what the magic of this research was when you went to that UI and grabbed the can of Coke from the floating menu system, a robot that's your personal assistant, walking around the room or rolling around the room with you, goes to the fridge, grabs a can of Coke, and rolls over to you at your desk. What they had shown was a user interface that doesn't exist yet for consumers. But when all the technology is in place, this can happen. That you can be fully immersed in a virtual world. You can be out on Mars, out on Jupiter, and this is the user interface that would be required to keep you immersed in your space, but also pull something in from your reality. And you apply this idea to everything. Like you could imagine if robots make all of our deliveries for us. Well, there's no reason why this package indicator couldn't be used by Amazon to show you when a package is going to arrive on your front doorstep. So like if Amazon's analysis is good enough, they can show you a little progress bar of your package and it slowly fills in over like 2 days, right? 1%, 2%, 3%. And you could look over at it any time and oh, where's my package? Oh, it's 40% delivered. And then it gets to 99 and 100% and you get a little ding and you go out your front door and there's your package sitting right there. It's been delivered. This is totally a doable system for basically everything. So the next question is, what is one VR demo, headset reveal, developer interview, or convention moment that still lives in your memory because it felt like seeing the future early? Yeah, there's a bunch of those. My mind immediately went to the first Vive demo, which had a bunch of wires coming to it. I think I saw it in 2015, and I got to see room scale and chaperone for the first time, where I watched a person in front of me walk up to a wall and then like sort of pull back when they saw the chaperone. And gosh, there were inches from walking into the wall when the chaperone system had to sort of notify them that they're going to hurt themselves if they keep going. And it made my monkey brain realize, oh, wow, I should not do that when I put the headset on a few minutes later. But no, the one that I think really matters with this answer is 2017, I believe it was. Maybe it was 2018. At GDC, there were eye tracking demos done by Valve and Tobii. It might have been SMI as well. So two eye tracking companies, and they had modified HTC headsets to add eye tracking. One of the demos was demonstrating how it changed social interaction in VR, and you could really make eye contact with other people. And the other demo was how it could change throwing or interactions with a game. You put the headset on, you calibrate the eye tracking to your eyes in much the same way that the Apple Vision Pro calibrates your eye tracking today. They very clearly took a page out of Tobii's system when Apple developed its calibration. But you calibrate your eyes, and then the cameras inside the headset can track your eyes, and you're faced with a scene of basically, like, imagine a shooting gallery where there's a whole bunch of cans and bottles on pedestals on a field in front of you. And instead of a gun in this game, you have an object that you can pick up and throw at these objects over in the distance. Well, the demo would basically turn off eye tracking and then turn on eye tracking. So I could basically say to the demo person, turn off eye tracking and let me throw this object at the pedestals, and then turn on eye tracking, and then I'll throw this object again and again at the pedestals. Well, when the eye tracking was off and I tried throwing things at these objects, I basically never hit them. The throwing mechanic wasn't good enough to do what it needed to do. I wasn't releasing at the right time, or my grip was too loose. It wasn't recognizing exactly where I needed to be intending to throw these objects. You turn eye tracking on and it identifies what object I'm intending to hit. And suddenly I've got like a superpower. Every object I'm throwing is hitting its pedestal. I'm breaking all the glasses. I feel like a superhero instantaneously. So I do that demo in 2017 or 2018, can't remember which. And I wrote an article on UploadVR about it, and how all VR headsets in the future should have eye tracking. And if you look at Meta's history here, they shipped exactly one headset with eye tracking, the Quest Pro, and it wasn't even good eye tracking. And then you had the Apple Vision Pro ship with high quality eye tracking. I would love to see that Tobii demo running today on the Apple Vision Pro and see how it works. The learning experience for me was, okay, you give devs a superpower, like tracking where your eyes are moving. It's now up to the developer to figure out how to use that superpower. It actually isn't super fun for a lot of people to suddenly have a superpower. Like, where's the work here? Where is my skill when just whatever I'm looking at is what the system targets? If you look at a game like Pistol Whip, I remember when it came out, I don't think it had Deadeye at first, or maybe it was an option within the menu system still at launch. But that game, Pistol Whip, used auto aim, where you had a limited number of targets coming at you. And as long as your gun was sort of pointed in the right direction of the people that are coming at you, and you shot the bullet at the right time, you would get the points hitting them. And so, like, the game is trying to pressure you to be on rhythm and follow the beat of the song. There's a certain like threshold that the developers have decided for pointing the gun and pulling the trigger. And if you pointed the gun in the general direction and you pulled the trigger at the right time, you hit your target. You put on Deadeye and you realize that that whole John Wick feeling that you've got about yourself is a facade, that nothing you've done in this game is as good as you thought it was. Suddenly they've taken away the auto aim, and now you have to look down the barrel and really line up the gun shot exactly right and pull the trigger, and then also get to the rhythm of the shooting in order to get your full points. And like, gosh, that is incredibly difficult. They had built that game without eye tracking. right? Like eye tracking is another version of what I'm describing. And even on Apple Vision Pro today, the Apple ecosystem doesn't let developers have raw access to your eye tracking because you can learn a ton of things about a person by using that eye tracking. And whenever anyone says that Apple Vision Pro is a failure, you can come back at them and point out all of the things that Apple could produce if it wanted to right now using the eye tracking data inside of a VR headset. They could potentially diagnose illnesses or tell you to go to your doctor because of certain activity in your eyes that is identifiable years before any other signs. And the only reason Apple hasn't produced that yet is because it's freaking hard to produce that in a way that doesn't freak people out. That's one of the things that is really hard with this job is like they could use that eye tracking data and perhaps are using that eye tracking data to help with the diagnosis of certain things. There's all these features in the watch that are already years ahead here, where like you can be alerted if your heart is making certain beat patterns, indicating something that you should go check your doctor for. The exact same thing can be done with the Vision Pro and with the eye tracking in the Vision Pro, and it will be one day, right? Like, and that's, one of the reasons Apple built this thing and is committed to it is one day it'll be another health device that you can use to help yourself and make better choices. And if the software isn't built to support those better choices, then it's a creepy thing that you don't actually want. What did working on VR Download teach you about explaining VR to people who are not inside the industry? What a fascinating question. So VR Download, I loved participating in VR Download, and each week we would get all of our regular viewers as well as a bunch of people that are like first time viewers. They've just popped in and they're like, why are you choosing to appear here as cartoons? And I understood that criticism. We're using the best avatars that Meta has put out to the market. They're not great, but we're using it to just meet together. My colleague over in England and myself in New York or Arkansas or California, where I've migrated over those places over the last 5 years. And we're able to feel like we're in this room together. And I'm able to pick up on like micro movements from my colleague. Like I could tell him being annoyed at me going down a certain direction on a podcast, or like I could see him point with his fingers at the screen to indicate a commenter had left something. So then I looked down at my tablet and realized, oh, this commenter is new to VR. What did working on VR Download teach you about explaining VR to people who are not inside the industry? It's a difficult question because a lot of the regular viewers of VR Download are inside the industry. They believe in the media, a lot of the regular viewers. And then you would get these random people that would look at these silly sim-like avatars and wonder, why are you doing this? And you'd have to explain to them, well, wait, these won't always be the sim-like avatars. One day we will look like humans. The avatars will get that realistic. And then we'll layer back everything else about our environment as we want. What I'm describing here is true of everything. Meta shuts down Horizon Worlds earlier this year, yet they still keep Horizon Hyperscape going. They still have the system in place where you can scan your living room and give it to Meta servers and then go back and visit yourself, but you can't invite other people to it. What Meta realized in the last year or two since Apple Vision Pro shipped was not that Apple was like making a product that was for, what was it Mark Zuckerberg said? There's only one thing better about the Vision Pro than the Quest 3, and that's the screens. You think about what he says, something like that. What you have to realize is he's the ultimate promoter. He and Andrew Bosworth always will speak in support of their current strategy, no matter how stupid their current strategy is. And that comment that Zuckerberg made, I think, should haunt him for years to come, where he was trying to talk down. Like it points how little vision or sort of product thinking is really present in the very top level of Meta's ecosystem. They bought a gaming company, they're going to build a game console, and they are able to reach a certain number of millions of game consoles there, despite it not having any traditional games. So you can't play a bunch of your flat games, and they're faced with Steam coming in to take that market. And then you've got Apple trying to make videos a market. You know, Meta just made 10 years of product explorations that weren't good enough. And then they didn't have a long enough attention span to stick it through when, if they realized, if they had really smart thinkers and the right organizational structure behind it, they could have realized, if we take the displays up to this resolution, then this market that's just interesting right now becomes mass market at this level. Or if we're able to do like I said earlier, where others can log in on other devices and tune into the same movie, and we build hooks so that people can, let their existing movie libraries do this sort of thing. That's what's needed. And they just didn't have the attention span to do it. They had to speak in support of the current 6 months of thinking and not realize that it's actually going to take more like 4 or 5 years for a particular thing to mature. And it's going to take an investment and take the prices out of the $500 pricing category up to $1,000 in order for this sort of thing to succeed. But going back to what did working on VR Download teach you about explaining VR to people who are not inside the industry? Yeah, this avatar thing is a great example of just how small-minded certain groups of people can be, how they need to be walked through step by step, that these things are going to improve dramatically. And, some things are going to take years of slow progress, but some things are the way they are because the prices are the way they are. And so you point out that the Apple Vision Pro is a $3,500 beast. Well, I can look like myself inside of it. It still looks a little weird. It's not perfect, but it is really impressive. And for lots of video calls, I'd be happy to show up as my persona avatar instead of my actual person on camera, because it's easier to control what the person sees on the other end. I don't have to shave my face before I go on. I can use the way I looked on the day that I recorded. I don't have to worry about my kid walking into the camera. I don't have to worry about my background. I can trust the headset to control the microphone recording. People connecting these two things of these hyper real avatars to these cartoon avatars that we were on the VR Download just was extremely difficult for folks. There will be one day when VR Download is using the codec avatars, and there should be a VR Download out there where the avatars look hyper real. And when that moment happens, they won't have to wonder why Meta's Horizon Worlds failed. It'll be entirely apparent. It'll be wait, 3 years ago you looked like cartoon Sims? Of course that was destined to fail. My God, how friggin' stupid could it be? It was the wrong decisions made by the wrong departments in the wrong order. And that's why you ended up with these, silly avatars that weren't really useful to people. And, we were doing VR Download just in anticipation of that moment. Next question. Do you have any funny or human behind the scenes stories from VR Download? Technical disasters, awkward live moments, accidental comedy, spilled drinks, anything listeners never got to hear? We started using external mics for a period. So we would clip on a microphone to our lapel and route the audio through in a separate way than the headset. So we would always be on audio call, even if we took the headset off. And that leads to some uncomfortable situations if you walk to the bathroom while wearing the microphone still. Going live on the internet in front of hundreds of people is a stressful moment. I had OBS running and would launch it on my PC and try to route the video in. And there are all these features that I wanted to have, like live video that we could pull in from another place and throw up on our TV. It was incredibly difficult, and things would break that would stop stuff from being possible. There was one episode or two episodes where I watched my kid while I was on VR Download, and my kid, my child, is running around the room. And the way I did it was I hooked a webcam up to either the headset or to my laptop, and I pointed the webcam at my kid, and then I pulled up this with multitasking inside the headset. So I was able to watch this webcam on a floating window while I was inside the VR Download studio and see what the kid was up to while I was broadcasting live. Would never recommend it, would never want to do that again, but it worked. It actually showed that I could create this bridge from being inside the studio to outside and sort of be in these two places at once, keeping an eye on both things. But what I'm getting at here is making a good experience for the listener, for the viewer, is a very hard thing. And particularly with what VR Download was and how David Heaney and I gathered our thoughts, right? I need to put 100% of my thinking into looking at the comments and responding to David Heaney. There was one time before multitasking was out for the Quest, I believe, and Meta closed down Echo Arena. And someone in our comments let us know that Echo Arena had been shut down while we were live inside the studio. And I believe I had to pull the headset off my head to search for it on my computer and find the blog post that Meta had put out explaining this, and then bring the headset back and explain things to the viewers. That moment when I pull the headset off is not a great moment for my viewers. My avatar goes wonky and the experience isn't great. It's a tricky thing. If you can pull up your screen from your laptop or your phone and do that effortlessly while you're live on a broadcast in VR, then you can sort of maintain the illusion of being this virtual newscaster. But if you're switching between realities and going back and forth between them, it breaks the illusion, it breaks your sort of space as a person, like thinking about this thing. It dishevels you. Also, accidental comedy. Yeah, there were various moments where our avatars got too close. That's always an awkward thing to suddenly get in someone's bubble, or to lean down on the ground, or move into a new position and suddenly you're in a silly position for cartoon antics. We could disappear behind the walls and then reappear in front of the walls. I always wanted to approach the camera in a really weird way, but lining up my physical world to the virtual world was never an easy thing to do. So I never knew if I had the space to sort of walk over to the camera. As an example of this sort of thing, David, for years there was never bottom halves to the avatar. So he very carefully set up the cameras to not break that illusion. The cameras are positioned in such a way that it only started the top half of the avatar, and became a running joke week in and week out, where if someone wanted to see that there was no bottom half, he would stand up and you could see that there was no half of the avatar, and we would both scream, and the regular viewers would freak out, and nobody wants to see that, right, type thing. Our regular viewers, I always love them for buying into that sort of humor of knowing what constraints we're working in and why we're working within those constraints. And then also talking about that idea that one day we won't look like this, we'll look like ourselves. Next question. What are some of your favorite positive memories of working with David Heaney or the UploadVR team during the best years of the show? I could always depend on David to have the technical breakdown of a technology that I really didn't have the stomach to convey to the readers. I'm always trying to find ways to make this stuff accessible for a very large audience, and that would be sometimes in opposition to him just giving this extremely technical breakdown. It wasn't on the show, but one of my favorite moments was going to Valve HQ with him. I have to convey that that's an overwhelming thing. For someone like him or like me that believes in this technology wholeheartedly, that it's just on a very long path to adoption, Valve is cooking. Valve is out there doing things, and you get one chance to go to their headquarters and ask them the questions that are on your mind, and also experience the headset, right? You got to experience the headset, you got to ask them the questions, you got to give enough time for your brain to think of the good questions after trying the headset. It's intense. And to Valve's credit, it's so important that I convey this as well. They let us record while we were there on the record. Everything was on the record. I don't think there were any times where I had to go off the record. And so they know that we're there to report. They know that we're going to ask hard questions. We're doing our best. We're overwhelmed by the idea that we have to do all this in a certain amount of time. And David is asking about the display panels. He's intimately familiar with the resolutions, the display types, the limits of those things, and he wants to know if Valve has ever thought of a Steam Frame Pro type device. And one of the Valve representatives basically comes back at David after he's asked this question 3 or 4 different ways of have you thought of a better higher end device? And the Valve representative says, do you want to work on it? And David, without missing a beat, really says, no, I just want to report on it. But I love the honesty on both their sides of like Valve, like, yeah, we've tried a lot of things. Please stop asking about this, sort of implied in their response. And David also being sort of like, I don't want to work on it. I just want it to be type thing. Like, I think it would be amazing. Implications in his comment. Also just sort of thinking about all the people that are going to critique this thing for it not being a certain display type or whatever. But I love that back and forth of the Valve person saying, do you want to work on it? And David having to say, no, I just want to report on it. What is something people misunderstand about VR journalism from the outside? Whew. I'm a trained journalist. I went to journalism school at Cal State Fullerton. I also worked in several newsrooms as an intern during my college years. My first job was in high school at my local community newspaper, which published once a week. And gosh, I covered stories like my first summer out of high school, a kid in the community, he and his brother were playing with a gun, and one of the kids was shot and he died from a gunshot. And I'm still 17 years old and I'm tasked with partially reporting about this sort of thing. I remember the family of this kid who died were in the newsroom the week after this happened. Another publication had written something that wasn't quite, the publication wrote something like, it is unknown if there was an altercation between the brothers. And this family wanted to show up on Monday morning to say, like, how could they write this? They knew the family had a gun and they were playing with the gun and it went off by accident. The other kid is sitting there. This family has had one of the worst traumas imaginable, and a poorly worded sentence, but understandable sentence, but still poorly worded, had worsened their trauma between this thing happening on like a Friday and now a Monday. And they've, over the weekend of processing everything, this article has come out in another publication and they want us to set the record straight at the publication I'm working at. I'm bringing this up because, I'm 17 years old. I haven't even gone to college yet for journalism. And I'm overwhelmed by the story, by trying to cover it right. These family speaks to us on the record for an hour and a half. And I bring back the notes and I'm like, how do I turn this into a story? What actually happened here? You're weighing the reality of this family just devastated, trying to tell their side of the story and set the record straight about what happened. I've encountered a lot of these real life scenarios in journalism over the years. There'd be a terrible car accident on the weekend and you get the cop shift once every couple months. I would have to come in on the weekend and call every police department in the county. So 15 or something police departments on a list of phone numbers that we've got to call and ask them what's happening in their cities. And some horrible accident will happen and I have to go out and try to knock on front doors and see if those families are willing to talk. And I would have journalists, seasoned journalists come in and explain to newsrooms, how do you do that? How do you actually do that job? It isn't easy. And the thing I heard again and again was, you're a human first. I'm a human first, these journalists would say. And that's what leads me to sort of interact with these people. So, with one of these interactions where I went to a front door, I'm wondering what I'm going to say to this person. And I knock on the front door. They're all in tears. They've lost someone. And I have to say, hi, I'm a journalist from the local paper, and I want to tell a story. This may be the last chance for the world to hear about this person who has died. And so would you want to tell me about who this person was? And I got in the front door one time. And then someone else showed up and freaked out and sent me away. And I remember like being on the way out, just saying, hey, I'm gonna park out front for a few minutes and then I'll leave. And I'm sorry to have disturbed you. And gosh, there are plenty of people who would look at that job and go, how disgusting. There's a really ugly way to do that, right? There's a way to do that sort of thing that is disrespectful to the people that are impacted. But at the end of the day, really believing in that mission. I'm saying to a person in their living room and they've just lost someone, and I'm like, really genuinely want the world to know about this person that has been lost. You can convey that, and there is noble purpose in that sort of interaction when it's done with your whole heart, when you really mean what you say. that really genuinely want people to know about this person. And the good articles you read out there in the world are led by real humans expressing real empathy and trying to get those stories. So, bringing that back to misunderstanding about VR journalism, I, I, I went to school. I was 17 when I reported on those sorts of articles. I went to college after reporting on that kind of article. I did internships where I had to do these sorts of hard hitting, like difficult conversation type things. And then I ended up technology reporting and obsessed with this technology. And it's such a different thing. Most of the interviews out there, you're getting set up with a business person. This is their day job, right? They have a family that they want to come home to, even though they're making lots of money at Meta. They got to, they're going back to their family afterwards, and that's what really matters to them. They're working, they're trying to realize Mark Zuckerberg's vision for Mark Zuckerberg, not for necessarily for themselves. That's true of a bunch of people, and they can put their heart into it, like 95% of their heart. But at the end of the day, it's still Mark Zuckerberg's company, right? It's still someone else's intellectual property. Then you talk to people like the devs who own their projects, and they're a different class of individual. They also have bought into the hype of this thing. They are often sometimes building something that they just want to experience themselves. They want to go into VR because it's a piece of art that they made and they want to just live inside of it. Those people are magical. They are few and far between. They're hard to reach. They're hidden all over the globe, and they are the lifeblood of this industry. They're why I do what I do. I am building out a little contact network of those types of contacts. And the kinds of questions I get to ask them, the way they talk about their work, it's just completely different than the sort of I've got to make a business for Mark Zuckerberg type of mindset that has been prevalent in this space for so long. A lot of these people are trying to make money themselves, but also like there were other ways they could have gone about making money. There are day jobs a lot of them hold, but then they're doing this VR thing in their after hours, right? Like that's the flip of this. So I'm saying all this to try to explain why my curiosity drives me as much as my humanity drives me. So like I'm curious about everything. Started off talking about the scale of the universe and all that, but you bring it back to humans and what makes humans tick and why they're inspired by their art. And like I get those people on this podcast to talk about those things, and I get them to go listen to the Anton Hand conversation where I had him for 2 hours. And he's talking about Elite Dangerous and having that moment of presence and getting to stand inside of his art and why he's invested in this market and the hard decision of having to take money from Meta in order to keep doing what he's doing. He didn't have a good plan B, I think he said. I contain that whole thing on my podcast, and that story is only on my podcast because I had the humanity to know where he's coming from, the difficulty of his questions, and you can hear his entire journey from his first piece of digital art that he ever made all the way to H3VR2 that he's building now. And he's so excited about that he's playing it himself a bunch. What I'm getting at here is I'm a trained journalist. I've practiced it since I was 17. I'm 40 now. And I believe in my heart in like asking humans hard questions, like getting them on the record whenever I can. And that's not true of everyone that works in this space. And I don't want to speak ill of YouTubers who are trying to speak to their passion on their channels. But if you don't combine these two things of like being passionate about the medium while also leading with your humanity and curiosity, then you end up in this sort of like promoting yourself more than the people who are coming to you. Or you end up like following false trends that are propped up by certain things that don't really move the needle. Meta was throwing so much investment behind Horizon Worlds, but a bunch of people are covering Horizon Worlds. And I'm looking at it going, no, like this isn't interesting. Coming back to this question of what is something people misunderstand about VR journalism from the outside, it's hard to do. And there's not a lot of people doing it. I really respect what Road to VR is doing. I really respect what Voices of VR is. Both of them are different than what I do. And, like Kent Bai is doing sort of like a voice record of this time. And Road to VR is good journalism, but it's also not tapping into the same stuff that I'm trying to tap into in the same types of ways that I'm doing. Go listen to the Iran to Finland podcast where I'm talking to the devs of Not Suspicious. Right. I'm talking to someone who has just gotten off of a series of, you know, a travel plan that brought them from a war zone to a place of peace. And now they're getting back to making video games. And like that story isn't anywhere else. I feel privileged to have been able to capture it, for my sources to trust me to share that story. The stories are hard to tell. They're hard to find, getting trust, getting them out. And they're all so very different than sort of Meta paid this company $30 million and now they've got a bunch of coverage. Supernatural, right? I talked to the coaches at Supernatural multiple times, and I'm so excited to talk to the coaches at Supernatural again now that they're getting a second chance at doing this thing as an independent company. Because those people changed lives. Like you can look right through all of, Meta is fighting with the federal government to get the ownership of this company. And just underneath it all are these human coaches going on to social networks and making phone calls to human subscribers to their service just because they want to improve themselves. It's this beautiful human connection that we have between people. And I think there's a lot of people out there masquerading as journalists who, through no fault of their own, just don't have their priorities set in the right places. You see a lot of people switching from VR to the AR glasses or display glasses coverage because that seems to be where the investment is. And nothing has changed for the artists out there who get to go inside of their creations and get to take others inside of those creations and get to like live lives that they never could live any other way. And those people drive me every day. And so like there's just to answer this question of what is something people misunderstand about VR journalism is it's extraordinarily hard to do. Where I started with this explanation, going to a front door of a person who's lost a family member, right? We had to pay for a service, or the company had to pay for a service that could search for those names and get that address to give it to me to go to that front door. Well, in VR, I have to like search for an email address or a link and enter my info into a website and hope after a couple days that those people, that the spam filter won't remove my message, or that my method of contact will actually connect me to the person. And then I have to gain their trust without them actually seeing me in order to come on my podcast or tell me what they're working on. It is not easy. It's actually probably more expensive to do what I do compared to the old way of like just knocking on doors, right? Like I have to spend a lot of time trying to reach out to people that are just impossible to reach. That's what I would share as something that people misunderstand. What technology, company, headset, game, or developer did you initially underestimate and later realize was much more important than you thought? Interesting question. Yeah, I've underestimated a bunch of devs. I think Gorilla Tag would probably be in that category. Took me a while to see Gorilla Tag was tapping into a particular audience. VR Chat might be in that same category where it's like, I think they were watching movies in there at the start, and then it became so much more than that as it really became the service that lets you express yourself in these various ways. I've overestimated a bunch of things, and I guess I've underestimated a few of those out over time. The advice to any dev out there is get me into a headset and respect my time. Like if I'm in the right place with my headset and I'm talking to you, it's fairly effortless to get into your piece of software and then give you impressions of the thing that you want my impressions for while I'm on the phone with you. But like scheduling 2 calls and sending written notes of like what I thought of a certain thing, that's harder, right? You're asking me to schedule a lot more time for a person. So like, I wish it were easier. And I'm trying to build this a good virtual reality where, like you can schedule an hour with me. And I've done this a couple times already where I can screen share what I'm looking at, and while I'm talking to you about your project, I can give you feedback on what I'm experiencing. And, like if that takes an hour and a half of my time and your time as a dev, I'm trying to use it so efficiently so that you get, like in many cases, if I do that with a dev, that may be one of their only raw real user feedback sessions that they ever get. And even that is not free, right? Like that's costing me my time. It's time that I could be spent publishing something or writing something that's for publication. In that sort of situation, the dev just really wants my initial feedback. I'm trying not to underestimate devs. I'm trying to always give them a chance to convince me that I was wrong or what they're working on is really interesting. I suppose I underestimate a lot of the shooters out there. I'm just not a multiplayer shooter kind of person. And you're competing in a very crowded category for a limited number of years. Like, let's see how long Forefront can lead the fray. Population One got acquired by Meta, and I don't know are people really loving playing Population One these days. And then there's H3VR2, which is a solely single player game, Pistol Whip, solely single player game. And those shooter games speak to me. Like those are fun games. But a lot of the multiplayer shooters, I tend to underestimate them. All right, last question here of the 10, and I guess there's a bonus question as well. After everything you've seen, what do you now believe good virtual reality actually means? There's a lot of bad VR. There's a lot of VR that's not worth your time, that you come out of it with a headache because it just wasn't good in one way or another. And I think good VR is where you leave the headset and you will remember that experience as a positive experience for a really long time. Walkabout mini golf, Acron Attack of the Squirrels, right? I go into VR for 20 minutes and my kid is a squirrel on their iPhone and I'm throwing them out into the distance, grabbing them, and the embodiment that you feel is incredible. So like, yeah, there's a lot of good VR out there. There's just a lot of really bad VR. So my answer to that is good virtual reality sort of transforms you in a way that you want to be transformed. Bonus question. If you were teaching a young journalist how to cover VR responsibly, what would you warn them about and what would you encourage them to love? Wow. Oh, good question. I think I covered some of that in my answers earlier about journalism. I would warn people about the influence of money and the influence of others who own publications instead of you owning the publication. The reason I started Good Virtuality is ultimately because I couldn't deal with that conflict anymore. I have dealt with other people owning my work for a really long time. I'm deeply thankful for their support. You know, they put up with a lot from me, pushing back at them and getting to do what I wanted to do for a very long time. But the moment you start worrying about money more than your human connection to another person, you make mistakes. And the mistakes might seem small, or they might stress you out. You might get frustrated trying to reach out to a person and them not seeing that you've approached them with your heart in your hands and with good intentions in your soul. The list of legitimate reasons why someone would want to answer your questions is endless. And so you have to be a little bit of a salesperson about the idea that if someone doesn't want to answer your questions, that doesn't mean they're being nefarious. That doesn't necessarily mean that they want ill will or they are undeserving. It could mean they're too busy. It could mean they've had a bad experience. It could mean they've had a bad day. The list goes on and on of reasons why someone would want to answer your questions. And so you just move on, right? You can't tell that particular story at this particular time. You get to the next one. You go to the next one. And you just approach every single person you can with this fresh mindset of leading with your humanity, what interests you, relating to the person, being honest and open and, laughing with a person and being real and let that lead your discussion. And if there is the need to make money, you have to separate it into a different portion of the conversation. It has to be separated from the reason why you're reporting it. I've said it a bunch of times since I've had to go off on my own here. One of the reasons I liked working at UploadVR, even at the Orange County Register back when I was there, is there was other people that got assigned to this task of getting money for the company. And so now at Good VR, I'm the one responsible for generating subscribers or negotiating with a sponsor and being responsible for doing that. And I'm still finding my way on how to actually do that sort of thing. But there's been multiple times where I've had to say to a person, hey, I would love your sponsorship, or I would love to find a way for you to sponsor this work so that I can do more of what I'm doing. However, if you can't find a way to do that right now, it won't affect my coverage in any way, shape, or form. I'm talking to you right now because I'm interested in what you're doing. I'm curious about it and I want to write about it. And as much as I can be, it's like, let's do the reporting, let's write the article. And then separate to all of that, hey, would you be interested in becoming a subscriber or supporting the work that I do in some other way? So my advice would be to follow your instincts and follow your heart. And when you reach a brick wall, find another story, go to the next story on your list. That story that you were thinking about might still be there in a year or two. And even if it isn't, it's fine. Another piece of advice would be if something feels wrong in your gut about something you're about to publish, really search your gut for why that feeling is there before you hit the publish button. You have a very good sense inside your brain of something being off, but not knowing what it is. And sometimes it really helps to sort of not publish something and just sit on it overnight, come back to it the next day. Thank you so much, Christopher, for the idea for this podcast. I hope this has been a helpful conversation with myself for my audience out there. This is my time to say, if you're not a paid subscriber at goodvirtualreality.com, please do so. And if you have any other questions you'd like me to do in sort of a part 2 for this podcast, you can email editor@goodvirtualreality.com. I'm also at ian@ianhamilton.net. So that's ian@ianhamilton.net is my personal email. And then if you want to write me about something specific to Good Virtual Reality, editor@goodvirtualreality.com. I am trying to take meetings with people whenever I can. And yeah, I do need the support of whoever I can out there, whether you become a paid subscriber or there will also be a donation link where you can just throw some money my way to help me continue doing this work. Thank you so much for the time, and thank you to Christopher for the idea for this podcast. We'll see you in the future.